Hello, my name's Peter John Cooper. This is my meditation on what it's like to be a playwright in the 21st century called Blood and Bones. Today, part 10, I'll carry on from the last episode and talk about metaphor.
Metaphors are dangerous. Metaphors are not to be trifled with. A single metaphor can give birth to love. Milan Kundera.
I don't get metaphor,
Says my young friend Skidmore.
At the writing course, they were on about it all the time. I'm not sure what a metaphor is, or where I'm meant to find one.
Look, Skidders, there's no point me going over all the technical stuff, but basically what you need to know is that the word originates from the Greek meaning to carry over. It means describing a tricky, abstract mental image in terms of a usually physical action, carrying the abstract idea over in a basket of everyday stuff, like smuggling a stash of tobacco into a prison in a laundry basket. To carry an idea over to explain another word so that it's easier to grasp is, in itself, metaphorical. Metaphors can also be conceptual and non-linguistic. I could still see Skidmore looking blankly over his tequila sunrise, but I persevered. This is where the idea of metaphor swims into view for the playwright. For me, all plays are metaphorical. This brief action on a stage represents a chunk of actual life we are trying to illustrate. I've got a feeling somebody's said something to that effect in a play before, but we'll leave that to one side for now. Indeed, for me, everything I write stands for something else. Subtext permeates my dialogue so that the actual spoken words are metaphors for feelings that are going on underneath. The very language we use is metaphorical. This group of sounds stands in place for these ideas going on in our heads. They bear no actual relation to the ideas except for this iconic metaphorical carrying over, one thing standing for another.
Can't you just say what you mean?
Says the now completely befuddled Skidmore. I do mean what I say. It's just that I use metaphors as sort of pictures to help illustrate what I'm saying. Along with all the other 7 and a bit billion other inhabitants of the planet, you must have gazed up at clouds on a summer's day and seen faces and animals, lions and dragons and strange landscapes, castles and mountains. You've experienced the same thing when you've looked into the glowing coals of a barbecue. That's because human beings are programmed to make out faces and animals against a confusing background of clutter. We need to be able to distinguish friend from foe, or the attacker hiding in the shadows. We need to make this sort of decision rapidly and without recourse to further scientific evidence. So our brain makes a snap judgment based on something we may have experienced before. That shape, tiger, bunny rabbit. Well, sometimes this mechanism gets a bit overactive and we see faces where there are none, but it is this capacity to associate shapes or outlines with other images that we call metaphor. Sometimes it's not so easy saying what you mean. You need a picture to help it along. Cognitive psychologist Peter Gardenfors of Lund University in Sweden, for example, argues that much of our thinking operates on a largely unconscious level where thought follows a less restrictive logic and forms loose associations between concepts. In other words, metaphors help because they aren't limited by the narrow confines of word meanings. Metaphor creates a trail of allusion and association. This way, metaphor seems to provide a short circuit between idea and idea. We live in a world of symbols and rituals. Everything we do and say has hidden meaning. Everything implies something else. Now, we seldom unpick the metaphors, and we can generally get the association without having to understand an otherwise illogical connection. And we can even begin to understand the mechanics of how this works. A study of patients with localized brain damage has shown that there are areas of the brain specifically devoted to the understanding and interpretation of metaphor. Vilyanur Ramachandran and his colleagues at the University of California at San Diego were intrigued by 4 patients who were mentally lucid, fluent in English and highly intelligent, but could not understand proverbs. When one of the patients was asked to explain the adage, "all that glitters is not gold," for instance, he completely missed the metaphorical angle, replying that people should be careful when buying jewellery. All the patients had damage to the part of the brain called the left angular gyrus, which lies at the intersection of the parts of the brain which process tactile, auditory, and visual information. Our use of a particular word or phrase reaches down into our brain and pulls out a rat's nest of related ideas and congruences. So the meaning of that word becomes not a single point of truth, but a fuzzy ball of associations. The picture that this confused, tangled image provides is sometimes, oddly, clearer than the word or phrase itself. It offers some sort of ranging point around which our meaning revolves. Clarity comes because that ball of associations is big enough to contain associations that are similar in the listener. They may not be entirely the same, but there are enough points of similarity to provide a correspondence, and thus a complex or difficult idea can be passed between us. The German mathematician Hilbert came up with a form of maths that was much later used to describe the quantum world. Mark Buchanan, in an article in New Scientist, argues that Hilbertian mathematics also applies in other areas and can be used to describe human interaction and explain the way in which human beings resolutely refuse to think in apparently logical ways. Interestingly, at another level, physicists themselves have difficulty grasping and conveying concepts of the workings of the quantum world and have to resort to entirely metaphorical language in describing subatomic particles. Quarks are described as having qualities such as charm, strange, up, down, top and bottom, and quarks and gluons having colour. Now, none of these relate in any way to the use of the words in our macro world. Metaphor is that crossover point between poetry and playwriting. A playwright needs to play with the possibilities of the language to convey complex ideas, and most of that will be through metaphor. And the resonances of the words in the empty space should echo out into the real world and stay in the mind of the listener forever. Perhaps for a playwright, the message must be, if you want to make specific points, the dialogue you use needs to be fuzzy and non-specific. Think logically, but let that logic be flexible. Our fuzzy, imprecise language enables us to access our fuzzy, probabilistic thinking. Not only are there more avenues of the brain explored by wider, looser speaking, but also better, more accurate conclusions are drawn for it. As a writer, I think it's necessary to understand the way in which metaphor influences our thinking and how our thinking influences which metaphors we choose. We need to understand how particular metaphors resonate through a character's actions and thoughts. We must enter the mind of our character so thoroughly that we can emulate their tangled mess of associations and differentiate it from our own. Choice of metaphor indicates a pathway of thought, unconscious or conscious, that reveals more than the character's dialogue reveals. Beckett was particularly adept at choosing metaphor and allusions which are perfectly aligned when fuzzy, imprecise metaphor is the only way of conveying otherwise inexpressible existential anxiety. They give birth astride of a grave, the light gleams an instant, then it's night once more.
For the true poet, the metaphor is not a rhetorical figure, but a representative image that really hovers before him in a place of concept. For him, the character is not a whole laboriously assembled from individual trays, but a person insistently living before his eyes, distinguished from the otherwise identical vision of the painter by his continuous life and action. Friedrich Nietzsche, The Birth of Tragedy.
Well, thanks again for watching. In the next episode, I'm going to talk about the way in which our wonderful, imprecise English language is tied in with this metaphorical, imprecise world. If you enjoyed this, please like and share and press the red subscribe button to make sure you get the next part. Meanwhile, be bold in your use of metaphor. Your arrows may just pierce to the heart of the matter. Thank you. See you soon.